Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this research event at the Courtauld. My name is Acacia Fimbo, and I am the Research Forum events producer, and it's my pleasure to welcome you along to the sixth and final event of this academic year in our Considering Collecting series. So thank you for joining us. I'd like to start by thanking our event supporter, Lawrence Suzel Associates Incorporated, a visual art advisory company, who have kindly made this series possible. The Considering Collecting series has been a series of online events open to everyone, which is aimed to draw back the curtain on what it means to collect today, be that artworks, antiques, social history objects, anthropological items, and everything in between. We've heard from collectors who are still in the process of building their collections, and those who have gifted part or all of those collections to public museums and galleries, as well as those people who work with existing collections in a variety of ways as curators, conservators, researchers. There's also been a chance to explore how collecting has changed, both in what is being collected, thinking about how the material of artworks has changed, thinking about the increasing number of performance-based artworks in many collections today, and also how the space of collecting has changed, with digital platforms being adopted by many galleries and dealers as a way to address both environmental and public health concerns over recent years. This term, we've been thinking particularly about how collecting intersects with issues of identity and representation. Last week, our discussion specifically covered women in collecting, thinking both about the narratives of women in historical collections and the position of women as artists, curators, collectors, and dealers in society today. It's been a broad and I hope interesting series, which has certainly prompted deep discussions and might even have inspired some people to start their own collection. Just before we get on to this evening's topic, and I introduce our fantastic panel of speakers, a quick housekeeping note. After the short presentations given by our panel, we'll be moving into a discussion session, including a Q&A. We would really love to have your input in this, any thoughts or questions that you might have on the topic. So the chat will be open throughout, and please do type anything in there and I'll get to as many of the questions as I can after the presentations. And so to this evening's event. Our topic is a rather wide one, the future of public collections. And I'd like to preface this by saying that we'll be looking at this from primarily UK-based perspective. And we'll be thinking a lot about the visual arts. So this is a really enormous subject and one that we can't possibly cover in its totality. But I hope that this evening will be a chance to think about the nature of public art collections, how things like collecting remits and acquisition committees might be changing, and to consider what those implications might be for their audiences, us, the general public. In particular, we're going to think about the representativeness of existing public art collections and look at some examples where individuals, groups and institutions have chosen to review how reflective of the public their collections are and what they've done to address some of their findings. So as I mentioned earlier, we'll hear from our panelists this evening about the research and projects they've been doing in this area, and then we'll have a chance to dive into some discussions and questions with them. Our first panelist this evening joins us from the Decolonising Art Institute at University of Arts London. Dr. Anjali Dalal Clayton is an art historian specialising in work by Black and Brown British artists, and as research fellow at UAL, she primarily focuses on collecting, interpretation and display practices in public museums, galleries and collections. She was a researcher on the 3-year AHRC-funded Black Artists Modernism project between 2015 and 2018, for which she led the first nationwide audit of works of Black artists in UK public collections, which is part of what she's going to talk to us about tonight. Since then, she's also been a postdoctoral research fellow with the Paul Mellon Centre for Studies in British Art, a co-investigator on provisional semantics, and is currently a co-investigator on the Towards a National Collection Discovery Project, Transforming Collections. Anjali, it is an absolute pleasure to have you with us this evening, and I will now hand over to you.
Hi there, can you see and hear me? Yeah. Awesome, okay, so I am going to just quickly share my screen. My camera is here, but I can't do talks without referring to notes, so you'll see me looking over here most of the time, so do apologise for that. So just hello, and first of all, thank you to the Courtauld and to Acacia for inviting me to be part of this evening's panel on the future of public collecting and to talk about my research on Black artists in UK public collections. I'm going to address 4 things in this talk. Firstly, I'll set out the context and impetus for the research. Secondly, I'll outline the scope and method. Thirdly, I'll briefly discuss the findings and questions raised through them. And then fourthly and finally, I'll outline some of the figures from our audit of the government art collection. So let's start with some context. So between 2015 and 2018, I was a postdoc on a research project at the University of the Arts London titled Black Artists and Modernism. And it was led by Professor Sonia Boyce, who you can see in this image, and sought to explore how Black artists in Britain have been involved in the key developments and trajectories of modernism in the visual arts, to make their existence and vital contribution known to as many audiences as possible, and to produce resources with which schools and universities could begin to address the absence of Black artists in art and art history curricula. And the centre and starting point of every element of the project was always the art object. And in this image, if you look at the very bottom left side, you can see just a tiny bit of Rashid Areen's 1969 sculpture, Boo. So, as I said, the centre and starting point of every element of the project was always the art object, which has, in the study of Black artistic practices, tended to be eclipsed by questions of identity, geography, migration, and cultural difference. So by making the art object our primary concern, questions of medium, artistic strategies, and art historical genealogies could be explored, in turn shedding light on the ways Black artists have been engaging with, critiquing, and taking leaps forward within the field of modernism. So in order to closely study works by Black artists, we first needed to know where to find them. Public art collections constituted a natural starting point, given their role in shaping popular and academic discourse on art. However, little was known about the extent of public collecting of works by Black artists, and there was no easy means through which to discover where such works could be found. So we decided to conduct an audit. We weren't the first to try this. I know that Lubaina Hamid, for example, has done brilliant research of Tate's collection, and I'm certain that there are other projects that have looked closely at how Black artists feature in particular collections. But we wanted something broader, an audit big enough to capture the extent of public collecting of work by Black artists across the nation, one that could give an indication of trends in collecting practices, and most importantly, one that could live online and be used as a resource for anyone wanting to know what artworks by Black artists are held by public art collections and where to find them. Now, although we would have liked to audit every single public art collection in the UK, it wasn't going to be possible in the short time frame of the project. So we decided that a small selection of larger collections that define themselves as having a national remit and smaller civic collections outside the capitals would at least provide a good enough sample to indicate what's out there. And by the end of the project, we'd audited a total of 31 collections, that's 11 national collections and 20 civic collections, with at least one in every region of the nation. And you can see the locations on this map of the United Kingdom, but not the names of the collections themselves, but I can let you know those later if you're interested. So, determining the scope of the audit was a complex and often uncomfortable exercise. Essentially, we were looking for works of visual art by Black artists who'd been born or raised in the UK, or had lived, worked, or studied in the UK, so that we might later be able to determine and argue for their contribution to the development of modernism in the UK. Unsurprisingly, the terms Black artist, and Black art, and their denotations were the subject of intense debate within the research team. Despite each of us having our own take on the meaning and use of these terms, we decided that the project would focus on artists with African, Asian, and Menorregian heritage. Now, this broad political usage in the field of British artistic practice is rooted in discussions that crystallized, excuse me, in the late 1970s and in the 1980s about a shared experience of racist oppression by British art institutions amongst artists who descended from former British colonies. In this context, artists with African Caribbean, Asian Caribbean, and MENA region backgrounds were typically included. Excuse me. Sorry. Although few British-born or based people of Asian and MENA region descent now self-identify as Black, the geographic parameters of the term are echoed in present-day cultural diversity policies through the term and category Black and Asian minority ethnic, or BAME. Cultural diversity policies relating to BAME artists have played an important role in museum and collecting practices since the 1980s, making the concomitant political use of the term Black highly relevant to the project and our audit in particular. The scope of the audit was also determined by the artworks. We were looking specifically for artworks produced and acquired between 1900 and 2016, a timeframe determined in relation to the project's focus on modernism in the visual arts and its legacies in contemporary art, which we understood as having developed throughout the 20th century with a continued influence in the 21st century. We were also primarily looking for works of fine art and photography, although we did expand this remit when auditing collections that covered both fine and decorative arts, where works by Black artists could also be found in applied art sub-collections, such as ceramics, jewellery, metalwork, and textiles, especially if the objects had been created primarily for the purpose of display. Conducting the audit and applying this complicated set of parameters was a daunting task at first. Traipsing around museum collection displays and pulling out the stacks in collection stores would yield a limited, inconsistent, and unreliable data set that would be completely ineligible for further analysis. So we decided to make use of each collection's staff-facing database and applied our inclusion criteria as consistently as possible to run searches in them. We filtered the data within the team, combining our existing knowledge of artists with online research of artist biographies and practices. Data on artists and artworks that met our inclusion criteria was then entered into an enormous spreadsheet, and by applying a variety of filters to it, we could produce a series of figures that could give us a sense of how collecting practices have developed around Black artistic practices since 1900. And now I'll briefly share those figures with you and the questions they raised for us. And I do want to preface that these are kind of rough figures based on a very, very specific set of data produced for a very, very specific reason, and that the figures should not be taken as pure fact. They're an indication. So across the 31 collections that we audited, we found 2,380 works by 378 individual artists and artist groups that met our inclusion criteria. This is much more than we were expecting, and it's certainly not the whole picture, given that we only audited about 3% of the 3,000 odd public art collections in the UK. And as exciting as the figure of 2,380 artworks may be, rough calculations indicate that the proportion these works by Black artists represent in each public art collection ranges between a fraction of a percent and 4%. Now, according to figures from Diversity UK, about 14% of the UK's population is from a BAME background. So the proportion that works by Black artists represent in public art collections doesn't come close to correlating with the populations they are owned by and exist to serve. So this raises the question of whether public art museums and galleries do and should take into account local and national social demographics when developing their collections. Looking at who the most collected Black artists are, we were intrigued to discover that amongst the 25 most collected Black artists across the dataset, which you can see here, there are several lesser known figures within the canon of Black British art. What is it about artists such as Kim Lim, Pradip Malde, Nusrat Afzal, Liam Woon and Joy Gregory, for example, that has led them to be better collected than other arguably better known Black artists such as Frank Bowling or Anthea Hamilton? Are there kinds of practices or even kinds of content that are consciously or subconsciously favoured when institutions bring works by Black artists into their collections? And how do practical concerns and circumstances merge with intellectual agendas, activities within the commercial art market, and also with established institutional attitudes and practices to inform which Black artists enter public collections? We also learned that, contrary to our expectations, the number of Black artists represented by smaller civic collections is in several cases on par with the larger nationals. And this seems to suggest that the number of Black artists represented in a public collection doesn't necessarily depend on its size, status, or spending power. We also found that there was a degree of parity between larger national and smaller civic collections in terms of the numbers of works by Black artists they hold, although the nationals do tend to dominate amongst the top 10. And what's really interesting here is that Bradford, a small civic gallery, holds the highest number of works by Black artists in its collection by a long stretch. It holds 92 more works than Tate's collection of work by British artists. This is quite remarkable, given that smaller museums and galleries outside the capitals typically have fewer resources to develop their collections with. And we were so intrigued by this that we invited Dr. Pamela Crawford to research Bradford's collecting history. And one of the things that her research revealed was that the quantity of works by Black artists in Bradford's collection had resulted from conscious, targeted acquisitions that responded to local demographics, and that this approach was spearheaded in the 1980s by a particular individual who was committed to representing local audiences in the collection. And this raises the issue of whether targeted collecting initiatives should be used more widely to develop diverse and representative collections of art, and whether the employment of such initiatives depend on the subjective individual agency of those with decision-making powers in collecting institutions. The example of Bradford certainly seems to suggest that both are vital, as too does the more recent and perhaps better known example of that at Baltimore Museum of Art in the United States. In 2016, Baltimore came under the new directorship of Christopher Bedford, who set about deaccessioning several valuable works in the collection by artists such as Andy Warhol and Robert Rauschenberg. This raised $80 million for the museum to fund new acquisitions to make its collection less male and less white. And although there have been criticisms of this approach, other North American institutions, including the Art Gallery of Ontario and San Francisco Museum of Art, are also exploring deaccessioning as a way to achieve equity in collecting. The final area of analysis we undertook was in relation to the artists that had been collected and when the collected works were produced and acquired. By looking at the birth years of all the artists and the year of production for all the artworks we identified through the audit, and simplifying the information according to decade, we learned that almost half of the artists were born in the 1950s or 60s, and over half of the artworks were produced in the 1980s and 90s. And this seems to correspond with the 1980s generation of artists associated with the Black British arts movement. Many, if not most of the protagonists of that movement were born in the 50s and 60s, began their careers as artists in the late 70s and 80s, and were actively producing work in the 80s and 90s. Excuse me. Then we looked at acquisition dates of the artworks that we'd identified and found that the majority of them were acquired in the 90s, 2000s, and 2010s. So what impact did the Black British arts movement have on collecting practices in public art institutions in the 1980s and in the decades that followed? So I've now come to the final part of my talk, and one of the collections we audited was, of course, the Government Art Collection. And since I'm presenting alongside two of its staff this evening, I thought I'd focus in on our audit of that particular collection and what we found. Now, for the majority of the 31 collections that we audited, we only looked at works acquired up to and including the year 2016. However, in 2020, and with the help of my UAL colleague Lucy Pardew and some additional funding from Research England, we were able to update our audit of the government art collection to include artworks that were acquired up to and including the year 2019. So bear that in mind when you see the next figures. So, looking at works by Black artists in the collection that were made and acquired between 1900 and 2019, we found 184 artworks by 77 individual artists that met our inclusion criteria. These artworks represent about 2% of all the artworks in the government art collection that were made and acquired since around 1900. And this is in keeping with what we found with the other 30 collections that we audited. Over half of these artists were born between the 1960s and 80s, and more than 2/3 of the artworks that were made by them were made and acquired in the 2000s and 2010s. Now, this bucks the trend of the data set as a whole. That is, while many of the Black artists in the other collections we audited, especially the civic collections outside London, were from the 1980s British Black arts movement, very few in the government art collection are from this generation. In fact, as you can see here, the majority of works by Black artists were both made and acquired in the last 2 decades. And given the opportunity, it would be really interesting to find out why the government art collection seems to have a different collecting pattern to most of the other collections we audited, and if this is to do with the nature, remit and policies of this particular collection, or if it's to do with particular staff, the makeup of advisory committees, or the influence of changing cultural and political climates. So that's me done, and I'd now like to hand over to Eliza and Chantal, who are going to talk about the impact of the BAM audit on the government art collections, collecting policies and practices, and much more, I think.
Thank you so much, Anjali. That was really fascinating, and actually doing that breakdown of the dates when works were made and also acquired was really interesting, and something I hadn't even thought about in terms of this sort of how, you know, collecting policies have changed and where they might change again in the future. So thank you so much for that. As Anjali says, we're now going to hand over to Eliza Gluckman and Chantal Condren from the Government Art Collection. The Government Art Collection has existed for over 120 years and holds over 14,700 works of art with the aims of promoting British art, history and culture internationally. And we're really, really excited to have them with us this evening. Chantal is the collection's curator of public engagement, and she is currently working with the Herbert Art Gallery Museum on a legacy project as part of Coventry UK City of Culture 2021. And in 2019, she delivered the schools programme that accompanied the loan of government art collection artworks to public spaces in Waltham Forest, London Borough of Culture. Eliza took on the role of director of the collection in January 2022, having previously been deputy director and senior curator. And in 2018, she conceived of the Representation of the People project, a 10-year commitment to assessing and addressing representation in the collection. And it's this project which she and Chantal will be talking to us about this evening. So Eliza and Chantal, thank you so much for joining us, and I'll hand over the floor to you.
Thank you very much for having us. Thank you. Chantal's going to talk first. Let me just share the screen 1 second. Thank you. So I hope you can see my slides. So thank you, Anjali, for kicking off this evening, and thank you also, Acacia, and all your colleagues at the Courtauld for inviting Eliza and I to join the last in the series of Considering Collecting. To give a little context, in case you haven't heard of us before, the Government Art Collection, or GAC, we are nearly 125 years old, the collection is. It's a national accredited collection of art spanning the 16th to the 21st centuries. Artworks spend the majority of their time beyond one location, and approximately 2/3 are dispersed across the UK and internationally in 365 buildings and 129 countries. It also occupies the unusual position of sitting within a government department, the Department for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport. The function of the collection is to promote British art, history and culture. Internationally, we do this by working with diplomats in post at British embassies and consulates around the world, while in the UK, we select displays for ministerial offices and government departments, including at number 10 and 11 Downing Street. Here's a great image here of Levena with her 1010 print last year at number 11. So during this part of this evening's talk, I'm going to give an overview of how the BAM project positively influenced aspects of the GAC's collecting and programming since 2016. And then I'm going to hand over to Eliza, who's going to discuss the development of our new acquisition and collecting strategy since 2020. And this is going to be followed by the Q&A with all three of us, led by Acacia. So in 2016, as Anjali has outlined, the GAC was invited by the BAM AHRC group at UAL to be one of the 8 national British collections for inclusion in the research audit. Recognising immediately the value and rigour of the research, 2 GAC curators took on the responsibility for analysing and submitting the data. And as Anjali has outlined, the audit of the GAC revealed that in 2016, 51 Black British artists were identified, Black and non-Black, born from 1900 on, whose work was represented in the collection. And of those 51 artists, Shirazeh Hushiari and Joy Gregory were the most collected female Black artists, each having 6 artworks in the collection. At that time, the most collected male Black artist in the GAC of the 51 artists was Chris Ofili with 14 artworks. There was a total of 134 artworks produced by the 51 Black artists identified within the GAC. And as Anjali has just mentioned, when the second audit occurred by 2020, that had shown that collecting between 2016 and 19, the number of individual Black artists had risen to 77 and artworks to 184 artworks, which represents around 2% of all the artworks made between 1900 and 2019 in the collection. The results of the BAM research were valuable internally in terms of curatorial knowledge and a renewed focus on some artists' work of which little had been historically catalogued. A really good example are 3 works by Ben Nwonwu, 2 paintings acquired in 1948 and 1 sculpture acquired in 1950. The then GAC Picture Committee had shown foresight by acquiring Nwonwu's works shortly after he left the Slade in 1947, and just on the brink of widespread success in Paris and London from the mid-50s. Renewed global interest in modern and contemporary African art highlights Nwonwu's significant position within the re-evaluation of modern African art in a post-colonial era. Embracing themes based on an informed knowledge of Igbo and Edo Kingdom visual culture, his art re-evaluated romanticized depictions of Africa, and in doing so brought a fresh outlook to art forms that chimed with the rising Pan-African independence movements of the 1950s and 60s. The BAM research highlighted a wider re-evaluation of Nwonwu's work within the international art community since his death in 1994, for instance, highlighted by the major conference that was dedicated to his work and legacy at Tate Modern in 2017. 2018 was a significant year also for the GAC in terms of representation in the collection for a number of reasons. That year, the GAC was invited to curate a display to coincide with the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, a major international summit hosted by the UK government in London that spring. The exhibition Shifting Identities, New Stories at the GAC's former site from April to July that year included Nwonwu's work Dancing Girls. And in the same year, the former GAC director Penny Johnson met Nwonwu's son in Lagos in connection to his sculpture Fulani Girl, which was installed at the British residence that year, where it remains on view. In 2018, the GAC set out to collect only artworks produced by women, a commitment to mark the centenary of the Representation of the People's Act, a groundbreaking legislative act that saw the partial suffrage of women in the UK in 1918. Artworks purchased that year included Portrait of a Lady Wearing a Satin Oyster Dress, a beautifully intriguing 17th century painting by Joan Carlyle, which you can see in the bottom left corner. Joan Carlyle was one of the earliest professional female portraitists working in Britain. While looking at contemporary work, Phoebe Boswell's startling drawing I1, which you can see at the centre bottom of the screen, also came into the collection, a self-portrait that documents a moment of resilience and healing after a period of trauma. The centenary was widely acknowledged in 2018 with many arts institutions responding with a range of reflections and exhibitions, some making serious commitments to reassess gender imbalances and pronouncing change, others more of a tokenistic gesture. This systemic treatment of artists unsupported by societal structures is replicated across gender and race. The BAM project was instrumental in drawing attention to GAC works that had remained hidden by neglect, and it is fair to say that the GAC's participation in the research has led to a much richer knowledge and understanding of works in the collection. The GAC's decision in 2018 to spend all of its acquisitions budget on works by women coincided with conversations beginning with the British Council collection and the Arts Council collection around looking for efficiencies between the three collections. One outcome was the formation of a number of working groups, which included joint curatorial group. And over this period, we recognised shared concerns about representation in the collections, representation within the predominantly white group of women in the room, and the overall structures within which we worked. Over this period, we also continued conversations with academics involved in the British Artist Modernism project as UAL's Decolonising Arts Institute formed. In recognition that 1918 had marked a partial suffrage for women, and it was in fact a further 10 years before all women got the vote, the GAC set out to create an extended timeframe to enact meaningful change. And for the GAC, this has resulted in the start of the Representation of the People project 2018 to 2028. This project broadly looks to assess and evaluate areas of inequality across every aspect of the collection's activity, with a focus on representation across age, disability, gender, race, sexuality, faith, and social economics. Through collective commitment to review our displays, interpretation, collaborative partnerships, and acquisitions, this is a continuous process of dialogue, questioning behaviours and practices, and challenging ourselves. I'm now going to hand over to Eliza.
Thank you, Chantal. 2020 needs no introduction as a year that challenged us all personally and at work. And for the collection team who moved online and in and out of lockdowns with the rest of the UK, one immediate challenge was how to handle our normal commitment to acquiring works. The Advisory Committee on the Government Art Collection ordinarily meets 3 times a year and is a public sector working group. Its official constitution is to approve and give advice on the purchase, commission, gift or bequests of works of art in order to meet the GAC's objective of promoting British art and culture in major government buildings in the UK and around the world, as well as advising on its stewardship. The current committee includes ex officio roles, and those are roles that are held by a post rather than an individual. These are the director of the collection, the director of the National Gallery, the director of the National Portrait Gallery, and director of Tate, which is now Tate Britain specifically. The roles have helped shape the collection since 1935, originally as the Overseas Picture Committee. Today, independent members include Claire Lilly from Yorkshire Sculpture Park, Melanie Keane, director of the Wellcome Collection, art consultant Mary-Ann Pryor, the art critic Ben Luke, and the artist Professor Susan Collins at the Slade School of Fine Art. We see the responsibility of acquiring works not simply as the natural trajectory of telling an ongoing and evolving story of artistic practice and concerns in the UK, but also as an important space for engaging with and supporting artists and galleries. Our annual budget is just over 300,000 and is usually spread over the financial year. The team work to bring selected works in by the director and the curators, and we physically bring them into the building, and they are seen by the committee 3 times a year for approval. In March 2020, the network of galleries and art fairs and access to artist studios and exhibitions was severed by the national lockdowns and uncertainty around travel. In the first months, we reached out to artists, curators, galleries and arts organisations to see how people were adapting and who was being hit the hardest. AN, the Artists Information Company, had done a pulse survey, and the results highlighted a dramatic drop-off of income for artists who generally relied on freelancing income for project work through art colleges and galleries and museums. We decided that our model of physical access to artworks was impossible, and to take this as an opportunity to switch from the constraints of a physical reach to the infinite reach of online studio visits and meetings. Research and conversations led to a proposal that was put to the committee in July 2020. We agreed to work with the Contemporary Visual Arts Networks across England and the Scottish Contemporary Art Network, SCAN, the Visual Arts Group Wales and the Belfast Art Forum, and travel everywhere through our screens. The committee agreed, and the next months were a logistical balancing act. We invited the networks for 9 regions in England and the networks in Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland to nominate artists through holding a meeting on a specific day, each choosing their own way, but asked to consider the collection specifics and diversity, and to produce a transparency statement. Once each shortlist was given to the collection, we followed up researching the artists and approaching 2 to 4 artists in each region. Our collection curators went on a virtual tour of artist studios from Ballygally to Penwith to select works for the collection. The project, which was called Art Across UK, has enabled the collection to support 45 artists, acquiring 90 works and spending 230,000 across the UK. It was announced in 2021 and creates an incredible legacy for the collection, as well as challenging new ways of working and previous geographical spread of artists that we support. On completion of the project, we found a diverse representation of artists within each region. 24 of the 45 artists were women, 2 identified as non-binary, 20 as minority ethnic, 6 as LGBTQ+, and 4 with disclosed disability. Overall, the project took up many hours and created challenging scenarios and a huge workload to the team. With international projects on hold and many of our 360 locations inaccessible, this was both difficult and exhilarating and perfect timing. It was, however, a very specific scenario and born from an unprecedented set of circumstances. So, how do we continue the positive work from this acquisitions process? Firstly, in the past 2 years, the committee approved small but significant additions to the collecting development policy. And these include a commitment to ensure that new member applicants are representative of the demographic diversity across the UK and will be encouraged as part of the collection's commitment to addressing representation. So that's written into the policy now. And in the context of artists, that the government art collection actively seeks works by artists who are representative of the demographic diversity across the UK and not already represented in the collection or are underrepresented in the collection. As for the legacy of Art UK, it has been agreed that the collection will continue to work with the CBAN networks, with SCAN and the Visual Arts Group Wales, and create a network in Northern Ireland over the next 5 years. We're committing to work with 2 CBAN networks a year and 1 of the nations. And this financial year, we're working with Wales and the East and West Midlands. We're currently agreeing terms of reference for the groups, and our new model will see us travelling and visiting studios as well as online meetings. We hope to build long-lasting networks and deeper knowledge of regional activities, which will impact on our engagement and acquisitions in the future. Art Across UK was incredibly exciting, but far from perfect and not sustainable with the day-to-day operations of the collection in full swing. It grew from a moment of crisis and became a positive and far-reaching project. We'll be building on what we learnt and looking to build a valuation into this new way of collecting and engagement. We'll be able to physically visit both funded and grassroots spaces, making our relationships with artists and organisations stronger. Fundamentally, we hope that it will expand the opportunities and build the collection as representative of artists across the whole UK. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you so much. I'm going to invite Anjali to put your camera back on, and I'm going to pop everyone onto the screen. Thank you all so much for those brilliant presentations. Really lots of, I think, thought-provoking questions that you've addressed. It's great to see also how things have been changing, the sort of the consequences of the work that you've been doing. And refreshing to hear what there still is to do and sort of how we can start addressing that. So thank you so much. Just a reminder to everyone who's joining us this evening, the chat is open, so please do put your questions in there and I'll get to as many of them as I can. We've got about 20 minutes now for a bit of discussion, but if it's all right, I'm going to actually kick this off with a first question. So you've all sort of spoken about the scope of the projects that you've been involved in, both in the BAM project and Representation of the People project, and the sort of the scope of those and where you sort of needed to set boundaries on things and the workload that does actually involve doing. So I just wondered whether there's anything that you would recommend for people working in collections, maybe people who have their own collections, those sort of first steps that you would recommend people take if they want to start thinking about what they have in their collection in terms of representation and what their next steps might be. Yeah, is there a sort of starting place that you would recommend, or particular activities that you would recommend that they think about carrying out as a first step?
I can offer something. I think that if anyone is, and after doing the BAM project, lots of different collections that we didn't manage to audit said, oh, okay, well, you didn't manage to audit our collection, but can we use your method to audit ourselves? And one thing I would say is, you can invent your own method. It's not rocket science to audit your own collection. But I think something that anyone needs to be clear about is why you want to do the audit, and then so what's the purpose and what are you going to do after you do the audit. So to sort of be really clear about the purpose and the question of kind of to what end, and then that can help you determine the scope and the different kinds of parameters that you're going to apply on doing an audit, the ethics of doing an audit, because one thing that I didn't touch on in my talk is how it felt extremely unethical to be applying essentially racial and ethnic categories to artists in order to be able to audit at all, and categories that artists may refute, may resist, that they may not appreciate being applied to them. So it's even if your intentions are good, you do need to think about the ethics of doing it and talk to lots of different kinds of colleagues, and most importantly, your stakeholders and the artists that are implicated in that process. So talking to the artists in your own collection about why you would want to do an audit, what you would do with the results of the audit, and what it means for artists to have an audit applied to them and their work. So those are things that I think people should be thinking about before deciding on scope.
Yeah, I think Yes, I completely agree. I think that it was a sort of amazing opportunity to have BAM approach us and do that for us in a way, to sort of I don't feel like we were in a place where we could have made those decisions alone. So in response to this question, we were going to talk about sort of thinking about collaborating with people in terms of kind of reflecting on what you want to do, like what is the expansion or the area that you feel that isn't quite right, or that the collection is missing, and that could be, I mean, there are so many different angles from which we could look at the government art collection and kind of unpick and in that way. I mean, one of the things about our collection as well is that we put works into working buildings, which does then very much it kind of restricts what medium we could buy, because things have to be able to kind of survive in a non-museum environment for some time. And, you know, maybe that then means that there are certain kinds of artists who perhaps do represent certain groups who are making specifically ephemeral work because socially or politically that's what they have to do, or that's what they want to do. So at any point you're kind of missing something, I suppose. So just having an understanding of that is, or at least a recognition of that, is probably important. And I think for us as well, definitely just collaborating more, being more open to working with other partners, but also recognizing, so for example, working with the Contemporary Visual Art Networks, they're all very different. Each one is a slightly different constitution as well, sort of governance. So one might be funded by an individual, funded by a university, and one might not really have a funded post. So there's that. Then you have to kind of think about the ethics of engagement and who you pay and how you pay them, and what level you're bringing them in at. So I think, yeah, just thinking through, acknowledging what you're missing by your focus, but also thinking about the people that you want to work with and why, not just to make yourself feel better or your collection more, you know, representative.
And I think it does touch upon something Anjali said also about, you know, looking historically at your collection, you know, acknowledging that there are always gaps, and that is often because of the policies of the time, you know, who was sitting in the committee, who was on your board, you know, and that is, we had various interesting conversations about this, certainly in, I think, the first and the second audit, about, you know, it was very good at making us focus on looking back on certain aspects of our history to really, you know, it kind of holds a mirror up to ourselves as a collection. You know, we can't apologize for past acts or lack of acts, but it's about acknowledging those and then trying to, as Anjali was sort of suggesting, trying to recognize how that has impacted on what has or has not come into the collection. And certainly looking forward and currently, you know, thinking about, you know, not wanting to make those same mistakes again, you know, to be much more aware of past practice and not to replicate it where possible.
Brilliant. That sort of feeds into another question I have, if I can sort of bounce off that, which is thinking about the difference between sort of representation in more modern and contemporary collections as compared to historical collections, which obviously, as you say, Chantal, what was being collected, you know, at times when it was being made, you know, would have been decided by other people, but it does often leave gaps in the collection. And how do you feel that it is different in doing this sort of work, maybe with a historical collection, where work isn't now being made, obviously, and so we have, in a sense, a limited number of works that could be acquired, and that obviously depends on their circulation in the market. Do you think there's a different approach to be taken there, with sort of trying to fill in that perhaps missing history from historical collections, compared to where we might have the more opportunity to work with sort of living working artists for more modern and contemporary collections?
Can I just check the question a little bit? I'm not sure that I'm understanding, but are you talking about, you know, collections that primarily have works dating pre-1900 and nothing sort of from the... Yeah, I mean, there weren't, I don't know that how many practicing artists of colour there were. I don't know anything about, actually it's not my area, my subject specialism, but I think, you know, it's a whole other issue about whether or not there was, say, you know, 18th and 17th century, you know, artists of colour, painters who were, I don't know anything about that, but I think that might be a case of partnering, you know, institutions partnering with researchers who do specialise on those histories, who are, you know, investigating, but also maybe focusing less on makers and more on what is depicted in the works that they own. So, you know, I can't help but think about Denise Morel's important work on French Impressionist painters and looking at the portrait sitters and the people depicted. I think there's just so many different ways that you could be looking at your existing collection if the remit of the collection is not to buy modern and contemporary artworks. I might think of something else to say, but I'll let Eliza and Chantal respond.
Yeah, no, I think it's similar to, yeah, I'm just going to ask the same thing really, but I think it is about approaching your collection from a different perspective, and just by the nature of historical collection, it's, you know, a finite time. So, but it is about, I mean, the BAM project was brilliant for us because it did make us, you know, we look at artists in our collection that we, for whatever reason, we hadn't focused on as much, or, you know, and I mean, Ben and One was a great example because, you know, it made us do that really important research to find out, you know, his position in mid-20th century art, the art scene, certainly in London and in Paris, and that, you know, you get a much broader context of that person's work and that person's position at that time, rather than just focusing on the artwork. So I guess with the historical collection, it's a similar thing about perhaps not taking the same viewpoint on an artwork. If you're writing about it, you're interpreting it, you're talking about it. You know, every collections do fall into these patterns of having the same narrative, perhaps, about their artworks, particularly famous artworks and, you know, very well-known artworks. So I think a process like an audit is also a really good exercise for us to, you know, again, self-reflect and look at what we're saying and how we're engaging with these works, and actually go and find those hidden histories that will be there. And I think I agree that means, you know, partnering with an external researcher or academic, that is always a, you know, really fruitful collaboration.
I suppose it's bouncing off what you've already got, isn't it? Because just you saying that made me think of all those artists who probably were there, all the women or working class artists or whatever, whose works just, you know, they've never been cared for or looked after. I mean, so they just don't exist anymore. And if you don't have that kind of continuity of care or value, I mean, it even can think about works in our collection, I think, that probably have been put in certain occasions and left for 30 years. And it's only, you know, now you sort of go, well, you know, Eileen Agar, now everybody wants to loan our Eileen Agar work, but I don't think anyone paid any attention to it for decades as well. So there's a kind of yeah, it's about shining that spotlight, I suppose.
I mean, just to respond, Eliza, I mean, I don't know that I would agree that the works don't exist, or that the artists, they may well exist, but in people's attics or in people's homes or in other random collections, hospital collections, or, you know, there may be works by working class artists, women artists, artists of colour residing somewhere. So it's about efforts being made somehow to unearth those hidden art histories, those hidden works that weren't collected. You're right, they weren't collected, but they may be somewhere. And so I'm always, you know, the question is, do our public art collections then have that responsibility to start that investigation and to see if works can be brought into the collection that were not collected at the time that they were made. Yeah.
Art UK probably do a lot for that in terms of works that were in sort of town halls and had been sort of relegated to other places. But I suppose I was thinking particularly about my time at the New Hall Art Collection, which was just renamed the Women's Art Collection, of artists who would either approach with a kind of, you know, whole legacy of work that was literally disintegrating. You know, there was, if there was nowhere for this to go, if this wasn't the moment when anyone was going to care about it or take it in, then, you know, the next generation were going to come in and put it in the skip, because that they're just, you know, you've got to have a kind of legacy of care. You've got to have someone who's looking after that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think there's a really, you know, maybe interesting consideration to make about, you know, not just where these works were in collections, but what was being, you know, done with them. Were they being loaned out? How often were they on display? How long did they spend in storage and things like that? Talking about this, you know, the demand there now is, it'd be really interesting to see how much more these works are moving now, being sort of seen and things like that. So we have had a question in, which is, I think, a really interesting one, and sort of a bit of a challenge for some people who might be carrying out an audit, that you might be able to offer some advice on. This comes from Kimberly. So I'm an archivist at a small all-girls boarding school in the US. It is our policy for students to self-identify race, and we have never, since opening, asked for students to divulge race. However, it's well known at our school that our first Black students graduated in 1966. There is a huge amount of artwork in our archives, and I don't know the race of the artists. I could perform the, I know, quite icky work of guessing based on yearbook photos, but I would inevitably be wrong in many cases. So do you have any thoughts on regarding what I might do to showcase Black artwork if I'm not sure who our Black artists are? I think, Angela, you sort of touched on this a bit in your methodology, but I just, yeah, if you've got any suggestions for an approach, that would be fantastic.
Oh, I wish there was a simple answer or piece of advice for this, because it really is icky. You know, that's exactly how, you know, we were relying in the BAM project, we were relying, as I said, on a kind of combination of within the project subject specialist expertise, so that we would know if someone called, you know, Rachel Jones is a Black artist or not. But then we would also, and this is where it got really icky, you know, put simply, I would go through spreadsheets of information about artworks, and if an artist's name sounded like it might not have European origins, I'd flag that for research, and then we'd go away and do online biographic research to determine if the maker met our inclusion criteria. But then, you know, it's problematic because you're getting into that grossness of applying horrendously simplistic racial or ethnic categories on a person. But then also there's all the names of the artists whose names don't sound, sorry, they are people with names that sound European in origin. And if you don't know that that person is Black or a person of color, then you're not gonna know. And I suspect that would probably more likely be the case in an American context. So yeah, I honestly don't know. I think it is icky. And I'd say if you're a white researcher, you don't want to be doing that work in isolation. I think it's inappropriate, unethical, and you want to be working with other researchers of color to go through archives and databases and whatever it is together with them, so that you can be in dialogue about the ethics of that process. But if you're already a person of color doing that research, yeah, that's how I felt in the context. Who am I to determine if this person fits my criteria or not? And who am I to make up that criteria? And I haven't resolved those issues or questions, and I'm still in them. I'm still auditing, and it's still fundamentally gross. But on the other hand, the way I kind of rationalized it for myself is within the auspices of that project, we were trying to do something good. We were trying to profile artists. We were trying to look at issues of representation. We were trying to, unearth artworks that had been neglected in collections. And it felt like in that moment, it was the necessary icky process that we had to go to in order to achieve that aim. But yeah, it's unresolved for me. I don't know what Chantal and Eliza think.
Yeah, no, I mean, but I think just by acknowledging that and saying and just declaring the difficulties and the issues, it's about being open and perhaps also, I mean, I can't speak for the person asking the question. I can't, give solid advice, but, perhaps it is also about, yeah, absolutely working in partnership, pooling knowledge and resources with other colleagues or other peers in similar organizations, and perhaps finding kind of whether it's digital social media platforms or something appropriate to start sharing the knowledge or the artworks that you have, even if you have the artworks, but you have very little information. You might just have the name, you might not even have the name of an artist. And, whether that's about actually just sharing that publicly in some form so that you start getting those dialogues from people. I mean, we do as a collection, and I'm sure most collections of any size we do get lots of inquiries and people saying, did you know that you have a painting by so-and-so and that person is my uncle or aunt or whatever? And actually those, they're great, because actually we would never have found out about that artist necessarily if, for whatever reason they hadn't had a prominent profile or exhibition history. So it is absolutely something you can't do in isolation. You definitely have to have conversations. And I think, as Anjali said, you have to acknowledge you're coming from a position of perhaps lack of knowledge in some cases, and you're reaching out. You need support and collaboration with others. Just being honest about it.
Brilliant, thank you. Yeah, thank you both for that advice and sort of a good way to approach it. And Kimberly's put her thanks in the chat as well. We are unfortunately out of time, but I wonder if I might just ask one quick final question to wrap things up, which would be thinking about this from sort of the other side of a public collection. As members of the public, we can often feel sort of a bit distanced from what's going on in terms of acquisition policies, and don't necessarily feel like we have any power to influence that. Is there anything you think that members of the public, people who would be sort of going to see these collections, do you think there's anything that we can do that would help to shape these collections to make them more representative in the future?
Can I ask you to condense or just like just say the question one more time? I was distracted by Elisa's question in the chat about a next face for BAM, which I'll respond to in the chat after, but sorry.
Yes, so thinking about these as public collections enjoyed by the public and sensibly collected for the public good, members of the public can feel quite distanced, I think, from what is being collected and how it's being collected. So do you think there's anything we can do as members of the public to help shape what is being collected? Sorry, it's a big question, I realise.
Okay, speaking as as someone who doesn't work for a public collection, I think it's really important, and this is already common, but for collections policies to be publicly available, and for them not to be hidden on websites. Often you might have to, sometimes you have to kind of go to some remote corner of a public collections website to find it, and I would like to see it like front and center, open to scrutiny, and you know, there's obviously, you could engage in some kind of public consultation if you're feeling brave as a public collection. I think it depends on what approach you're taking as an institution generally, and you know what your objective is and what your own values and ethics are as an institution. And you know, I think public collections should be answerable to the public that they exist to serve. And I know sometimes inviting people into consultation can be quite a difficult process to engage in, but I think it's something that you can't avoid. You've just got to do it. That's the nature of any kind of public services. It's got to be in dialogue with your public. So whether or not you could have initiatives where every year you invite a random member of the public to be on your acquisitions committee. Who knows what that would be like, and what challenges that might represent. But you know, there's all kinds of things that could be done. It's just up, you know, how brave are the collections to engage in something like that.
And we were just thinking about, I mean, the Art Cross UK project, which Eliza mentioned, obviously that, I mean, yeah, I think that, you know, the things Angela was saying, it is about being brave. The Art Cross UK project was, I guess, was a sort of way of doing that, which was going to networks, you know, in particular areas of the country, and they know, you know, the artists who are doing interesting work, and many of those artists who came into the collection, we wouldn't necessarily, perhaps, obviously 2020, as we know, is an extraordinary year, but and it has influenced our our strategy of identifying regions and areas every year, which will be different every year from now on, and we're going to be focusing much more looking at artists working in there, and we do have a responsibility, I think, as a collection as well, obviously, to go and don't wait for people to come and show us things. You know, we obviously go out and you see what people are making, what artists are producing, and you know, have those conversations with artists as well.
We did end up with the Cross UK as well. We ended up collecting works, bringing in works that were a real mixture in terms of artists in where they were in their career as well, which was really interesting. So some who'd maybe shown once or even never, or they must have somehow had been connected, that someone knew that they were working, and to Alberta Whittle, who just represented Scotland at the Venice Biennale. So quite a huge range. But yes, almost having that breadth and that project was so huge. It was a kind of proper year project without doing our kind of business as usual. But it was also a census year, which was quite interesting. So it's been suggested we do it every 10 years, which would be quite good.
Brilliant. Thank you all so much for these presentations and this discussion this evening. I know we've really only scratched the surface of everything that you've been doing, and yeah, Angela's just shared some of the work that she'll be doing in the future with the Transforming Collections project. So there's going to be a lot more coming on this, and I really hope that we might have a chance to yeah, maybe catch up in the future, see what's changed, see what's still changing, and yeah, and continue to review it. Yeah, thank you all so much. Thank you, Anjali, Eliza and Chantal for joining us this evening. Thank you again to Lawrence Uzell Associates Incorporated, a visual arts advisory company, for supporting this event this evening and the series this year. Tonight is the last in the series for this academic year, but you can find the recordings of all the previous events on a dedicated playlist on the Portal's YouTube channel, and do keep an eye out on our What's On for more of our collecting based events, which we hope to have in the future. Yeah, thank you again all for joining us tonight and joining in the discussion. Thank you, Eliza, Chantal and Anjali, and we hope to see you all again for future Research Forum events. So I hope everyone has a lovely evening.
Thank you so much.